Welcome to Crosstalks. This show is a collaboration between two of Sweden's leading universities, KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, and Stockholm University. This is the 21st episode of this series, and if you're curious about the other 20, just look under the headline Previous Talks to find them waiting for you. Please also note that tonight's episode is not a live broadcast, so it will not be possible for you to Skype or tweet us your questions. But if you'd like to ask questions of the participating professors, a live chat will open directly after the first airing of this program. So, if today is June the 3rd and it's now just after 7 p.m. Central European Time, you can catch our guests after the broadcast. Over the last 15 years, the web has steadily become more open and transparent. But beyond your personal homepage, Google, Facebook, and Twitter lies the hidden network of the so-called deep web that can only be accessed using specific tools. These networks are sometimes used by criminals for illegal activities, but the anonymity tools employed in criminal marketplaces also fill many legitimate needs in today's world. In light of the recent revelations of massive and often illegal surveillance by intelligence agencies, there seems to be an accelerating need for ways to protect our privacy online. Here to discuss tonight's topics are Gerald Maguire, Professor of Computer Communication at Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, Daniel Westman, Doctoral Candidate in Law and Information Technology at Stockholm University, and Stefan Nilsson, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the Royal Institute of Technology. Welcome. So, Stefan, if we start with the deep web, how would you describe this? If we, by that expression, mean dark networks with sites and communities that can only be accessed using specific tools. Explain as though I knew nothing about this.
Well, the web is a place that I think none of us really does understand because it's so new, it's so big, and we only see a very small part of it, even if we're experts. So to me, the deep web is not perhaps so much about the secret places where people meet and we can't know about it. To me, perhaps the biggest secrets that have been revealed in the last few years is what we've been learning from Edward Snowden's revelations, that people are in fact surveying what we're doing, and pretty much everything we do on the net leaves permanent traces in databases in several places in the world. And that is perhaps the big secret about the deep web.
So many of us have this idea that when we do things online, there are some traces, or there's a practical information. I write something and what I type can be read by people all over. That idea that if you post anything on the internet or if you send an email, it's the equivalent of shouting it in a square or so on. But there are also some more insidious ways of watching these data streams. And some of them are not about the words and the specific content. And then beyond that, there are secret places. There are things on the internet that I can't find in my ordinary browser, so to speak.
Absolutely. And my guess is that the largest part of the net is such that you can only see it. And that is accelerating as well. You find it more and more difficult to access even common documents. We have services like Quora, for example, that contains a lot of exciting articles, scientific articles, that you really have to give up your personal information to be able to access. So that's a somewhat worrying trend as well. So, and that, of course, is also the partly hidden part, part of the web. So
we have sort of gated communities, and then we also have, I guess, secret societies.
Absolutely.
Maybe my metaphors are fumbling here. I'm sorry. Gerald, how secure do you think that the anonymity tools that are available now are? Some of them are called things like Tor, Tails OS.
They're basically insecure.
Okay.
There is known techniques to be able to engineer the communication paths that are used through Tor. There are papers about it. There have been papers about it for many years. There are timing, latency attacks, etc. for it. Basically, the sense that many people have that it offers any anonymity is largely fictitious.
But certainly, I mean, these anonymity tools, so some of them
are pseudo-anonymity tools.
Pseudo-anonymity tools. Yes. Let's see if we can get some other opinions about this later on the show. But for now, let's call them that. Certainly, they are more private than my ordinary browsing.
I would disagree with that. I think that if you're doing it online, if someone has the technical means and the interest, there's basically nothing that you do that isn't going to be observed and isn't observable. from a technical point of view. Whether they're going to waste time observing you or doing anything with that data is a completely separate matter.
Okay, Stefan?
I agree with Chip that certainly from a technical perspective, it's an almost, or perhaps even entirely impossible technical problem to solve to get real anonymity. But that being said, it's also a question of cost. Using Tor obviously gives problems for the spy agencies. You can see that from their internal documentation that we've been able to read during the last year. Obviously, that's annoying to them, and they have to spend a lot more effort to do that, and they can't do it for so many people. So yes, it does make a difference, but it's not. But you should realize that there is probably no such thing as absolute anonymity on the net ever.
So one question then is who I'm keeping secrets from. If I'm keeping secrets from my neighbors, these anonymity tools are probably quite useful. If I'm keeping secrets from, let's say, the US government, there might not be anything secure enough in the world.
It depends again on who your neighbors are. Because your neighbors, in most places, I grew up in a small town, your neighbors probably know more than you've even posted online.
There's that. There's that. Okay, is it at all possible to be anonymous on the internet? For like in a practical sense, I understand that theoretically it may be impossible, but is it practically possible to be anonymous online?
In practice today, no.
Interesting. Do you have another answer for that?
I would say that journalists who take, for example, who take anonymity seriously, they certainly should, using Tor and perhaps the operating system Tails, for example, that has never writes to disk, is certainly a very good option. It would be reckless not to use it.
Okay, Daniel, I'm going to get to you in a little while, but I'm just have to process what I'm learning here. Okay, so these tools they're based on cryptography, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Yes. Am I understanding you correctly that you're saying that no cryptography works at all?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay.
The question you asked was about anonymity.
Okay, so what can we do with cryptography?
Right. If you want to protect what you're communicating, we know things like one-time pads, which at least as far as we know, are still not broken. It's very questionable about nearly any encryption algorithm that there is, whether or not it's broken. We simply don't know that. We only mostly know the ones that have been broken, but the ones that still are unbroken or unannounced that they're broken, we don't know. But one-time pads work really quite effectively. So if you wanted to have a communication that was secure and private, you could do that. And your cell phone today holds enough bits that if you could ensure yourself of the other person who you're communicating with, giving them the one-time pad, you'd have essentially perfect security, but not anonymity.
I see.
Anonymity is something very different.
So my information is secret, but the path it takes will not be.
No, even the path it can be anonymized and made more difficult. But the fact that if you communicate for any significant period of time, it's going to be found out who you're communicating with.
So how does a one-time pad work? Is it very complicated for me to use?
No, it's actually trivial. It's one of the oldest known approaches that there is. You take a bit stream, you have a pad, you XOR one with the other, and then without the key, it's just random bits. The hard problem is you have to generate a truly random sequence, and that's hard. And the second thing is you have to physically distribute it to the other party you want to communicate with, and that's costly.
Yes.
Right? And if anyone gets a hold of it, well, you've just lost all of your security.
Okay. Okay, I'm processing this, but at least it's a little hopeful in the market of secret keeping. Daniel Westman, people are using, I'm assuming, people are using these anonymity tools that are not flawless, and this means of communicating secrets which may actually work. They are using these tools to commit crimes, for instance, like buying and selling illegal things on darknet marketplaces. How should or could legislative institutions start to think about this or handle this challenge?
Of course, they have a lot to learn, of course, but as mentioned, there is no thing as a perfect anonymity. So there is also always a possibility to use traditional investigative methods, of course. And it could be different strategies. If you're selling physical goods, you can go after the physical goods, of course, still. And but you can also create new methods to investigate things online. There have been proposals in some countries to get special rules on police has the right to use hacking methods and go into to the equipment of the individual persons. And there you, even though you communicate with cryptography online, then you can still get the information at the source, for example. So there are different strategies.
And that would be for people who are trying to police these activities, I guess. What are the challenges for lawmakers?
There has been different proposals, of course, and some of the proposals is basically trying to get rid of anonymity, or at least try to make it harder to act online without showing you really the identity and what you're communicating. And I think those strategies kind of futile if you try to regulate what is a legal device, for example, because if on the net everything is computer programs, it's always possible for someone else to create that program and distribute it, and it's very hard to stop it. And you really have to rebuild the internet in order to uphold that kind of regulation. So I think it's very hard to have that strategy. And we also have these kind of strategies that we have seen with storing data about communication, storing metadata and so on. And we have the Data Retention Directive in the European Union that makes it up for the telecommunication operators to store data. And that has been declared invalid by the European Court of Justice because the lack of proportionality when it comes to the right of privacy. So it's a hard question. So the lawmakers...
Would you say that the lawmakers understand the issues?
No, no one, as mentioned earlier, no one fully understands the policy consequences of the internet, and we have to try to move forward, learn more, and discuss these issues, and we don't see the final policy conclusions today, I think.
Will we ever be able to have any kind of final policy solutions on a national level for something that essentially has no geography, like data on, or it has a geography, but the data moves across it disrespectfully of borders.
It's of course it's hard, but of course there are points of regulation that is local. For example, you can regulate internet service providers on the receiving side. For example, Telia and Bredbandsbolaget in Sweden. You can regulate what they have to do, and they have to block certain content, and they have an obligation to store traffic data and so on. So there's a point of regulation, of course, and then you can also have working together, cooperation between different nations on investigation method and help each other out and so on. But of course, it's very hard to. You don't want to have a cooperation with the Iranian government trying to find a person and so on. So it's of course, as long as we don't have the same rules and views on how to regulate the net, it's hard really to have a cooperation on helping each other out with finding criminals, because we have very different. We look upon criminals in very different way. Who's a criminal? Who's not? Who's a freedom fighter?
We're going to add a voice for privacy into this conversation. Joining us from Boston via Skype is Andrew Lewman, Executive Director of the Tor Project. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Hi, thank you.
Andrew, could you tell us what the Tor Project is?
Sure. The Tor Project is a research organization that works on anonymous and provocations, and we mostly produce research, and we also produce software, the most popular which is the Tor browser, which is a simple, easy way to download, be private online, control your information, and go from there.
What would you say are the main motives behind the Tor Project?
User empowerment. We want the users to be in control of what's collected about them and who they share it with.
So earlier, Gerald argued that Tor doesn't actually offer anonymity. It's a sort of pseudo-anonymity. How do you feel about this?
He's obviously welcome to his opinion. We have 15 years of research that shows that Tor does work, and national intelligence agencies who are telling us that Tor sticks because they can't break it and it does work. It works so well, they're angry.
That's a clue, at least. Or are they? I mean, maybe they're pretending. But if they cracked it, would they tell you? I'm starting to become very paranoid as a part of this conversation.
I don't think they would tell us. I don't think they would tell. And the documents we're looking at are at least 4 or 5 years old. So maybe they've already cracked it and they kept that secret. And that Snowden was not given access to those documents. It's clear.
So I'd like to ask everyone in the studio, even if it's not possible to be totally anonymous today on the internet, is it still important to try? Is it important for regular people to be able to use the internet without giving up their identity or their data, for instance, by using Tor?
Absolutely. And not only for like the obvious reasons that it's important to have the ability to meet without everyone knowing about it, and the ability for privacy. It's also about the fact that some things you only will do and only want to do if you know that not someone is looking over your shoulder, because that's the kind of situation where we want to try things out. I do a lot of things that I would never do on this stage. And yeah.
Daniel?
Yeah. It's up to the individual user. I think it's not up to me to make a recommendation. If you feel that you have something to say or communicate that you want to make it harder for someone else to intercept, then of course you should use this technology. And there are of course situations there where there is perfectly legitimate reasons to do that. If you were a whistleblower, but then of course you must be aware of that it's not 100% secure, as mentioned earlier. But sometimes it's enough to make it a bit harder to identify and so on. But you must be aware of the limitations, of course, when you use that kind of technology.
Gerald?
Yes, it's a risk-benefit. So if you're willing to put enough effort into it, you can increase the effort that someone has to go to the level at which they have to break into your machine, either electronically or physically. But you also have to accept that basically, if you write it, it's forever, and there's a pretty good chance that if someone's determined enough, they're going to get it. So is it worth the risk or not? As they say, don't do the crime if you can't do the time.
Perhaps if we can add one more thing.
Absolutely.
It's also a question about solidarity, because we know for sure that if only a few people use cryptology for their communication, they will be suspected only because of that. And we know that for a fact. We've seen that one of the criteria that NSA, the National Security Agency, is using is if something is encrypted, let's store it forever, just in case.
But it's cheap enough now to store it all. And that's why they're building a big data center in Utah, because the easiest thing is we don't know what's important now, so why not just store everything? You have the UK already that's now basically storing essentially several weeks of total bandwidth of the in and outgoing fiber traffic for the UK in case they would need it, because then essentially we can replay it. So why not just store it all? Storage is cheap. So I think you have to go about life believing that essentially if you write it down, if you communicate it, even if you communicate it near a person with a cell phone or a microphone on their computer or even the physical phone on their desk, it's probably being listened to and you should act as if it is.
I have many questions about this, but I'm going to bring in another panelist as well. Joining us from London, I hope, is Eleanor Saitta, Technical Director at the International Modern Media Institute and self-described hacker. Eleanor, you've worked a lot with both the technical and human aspects of digital security and privacy. What are your thoughts on this? If we start with the solidarity issue, should we use encryption and anonymization services for solidarity reasons?
I think we absolutely should, and I think we should also use them because they make a difference to our privacy too. Even if what we're doing doesn't particularly matter, that's no reason to let other people look at it if we don't, actively want to publish it. Doing anonymity online fully is hard. Operational security takes a lot of work. That said, it's not impossible. There are definitely people who manage to do it just fine. But yeah, it's going to mean changing your life significantly. I think while it's good to be realistic about our capabilities to protect ourselves against, say, a G8 or a global power that is personally determined to, is personally out to get us, I don't think it's worth scaremongering about everything being recorded at all times, because most people don't have someone at that level being out to get them. I do a lot of work with high-risk users around the world, and there's a very different set of advice that you give someone who is being targeted and who isn't being targeted.
Sorry, Eleanor,
I think that
what would a high-risk user be?
a high-risk user is basically someone online who's annoyed someone with power, right? So a journalist, especially a journalist who covers national security work, activists, dissidents, union organizers. There are a lot of different categories there.
I'd like to talk a little bit about this balance still, about the use of these services for crime and potentially, for instance, terrorism is the example that people in power always mention. How do you sort of do the cost benefit analysis when it comes to anonymity tools like Tor, for instance? Andrew?
We don't weigh. All technologistic. I work with victims of abuse and stalking and trafficking, and iPhones are their nightmare devices. The traffickers and the abusers control the iPhone. They do live abuse sessions over FaceTime, and so it doesn't matter. I've seen, if a Ford car is used in a bank robbery, you go after Ford saying your technology is bad, you should ban those cars from the road. No, of course not. All technology is agnostic. We, of course, work with law enforcement to promote the good uses. We work with everyone to promote the good uses. We work with law enforcement to stop the bad, such as when criminals are out using Tor. We spent lots of time with global enforcement agencies, from Interpol down to Swedish Organized Crime Agency to German VND to US three-letter agencies, explaining what Tor is, what to do, and what Tor cannot do. And every time we meet a law enforcement agency, almost everyone in the room works every day to protect themselves when they're online, protect their families, and also to hunt down criminals. Because from FBI.gov or SOCA.se, the criminals pick up on that really quickly. So it's balanced. We're out there promoting the good uses of these and work with law enforcement to stop that.
Eleanor, what's your view on this balance?
So the death of privacy and the death of our ability to maintain our privacy online is basically the death of free will, right? Security agencies and corporations, when they gather data, are gathering that data to be able to influence our actions. If we don't have tools that let us maintain our anonymity and prevent people from spying on us, then we don't get to choose how we act in the world. Being a citizen and being an adult means accepting a certain degree of risk in the world. I believe that these tools are, on the balance, vastly helpful. And yeah, there may be a few cases where bad actors achieve some degree of capability that they wouldn't have had without them. But we're adults. We live with risk every day. And if we don't accept that risk, we lose all of our freedom.
Do you have any responses to this? Do you agree, Daniel?
Yeah. A comment is that, of course, there are technical solutions to the privacy problem, but you should not forget the policy solutions, because, as mentioned earlier, it's not really possible to win against some actors based on technology. It's a technology war that you can't win. So there is an important policy question here. We must discuss the borders for example, what the national security agencies are allowed to do, but also regular law enforcement. So you have a lot of policy issues to discuss here and strike a fair balance, and to uphold traditional human rights, for example, when it comes right to private life, and balance against other interests and so on.
Stefan?
These kinds of universal attempts at universal solutions, either technical or policy decisions, tend to be very difficult because the internet is used for so many things. Let's say an anonymous forum that could be used by, let's say, recovering alcoholics, which would be a self-help group, and I think pretty much everyone would say that's a very good use for an anonymous forum. But on the other hand, the exact same forum could be used by anorectic girls to help them learning about how to starve yourself to death. And I mean, how do we make the choice there? Obviously, one is good, the other one isn't. So, and I think the solution isn't trying to come up with a general policy or general technical solutions, but rather try to meet these people in their personal life instead.
So that's one of the answer models that's often suggested, saying that this isn't an internet problem at all. This is like trying to legislate what we use highways for. So these are cultural issues, and that the existence of the internet is somehow irrelevant.
But in the legal sense, though, we keep running into this problem like metadata, where we try to write laws where we pretend somehow that it's not different. And the difficulty is, in some cases, for technical reasons, it is very different. So we have a problem today with IPv6 that's been well known for a decade, because the bottom part of the address is generated typically automatically from your MAC address of your interface, which means no matter where you go in the world, you always have those same bottom 64 bits. So it's just like waving your passport around everywhere. Yes, we can do cryptographically generated addresses, but there aren't very many people that are using that. So I'm not trying to scaremonger. I'm trying to say we have to be very, very careful how we do it. And if we really want to achieve privacy and anonymity, we have to work very hard at doing it. But it's a much harder job than we think. And the legal problems are very difficult for people to do absent the input of these technical details. And so actually, Alberto Escudero Pascual, who is a doctoral student at KTH, in his response to the preliminary part of the proposal by the European Union, actually changed their interpretation about the metadata of what is protected. Is the address on the packet, is that part of the content, or is it part of the metadata? And of course, there's very big implications from privacy between the two.
The White House recently released a document called the Big Data and Privacy Report, and I know some of you have found this to be somewhat alarming. Could you tell us why?
It's really simple. The easiest part is when they discuss what I believe is the beginning of Homeland Healthcare. Yes. Which is basically when you start combining financial data and healthcare data, because you're going to extract lifestyle issues, so that basically Homeland Healthcare will show up and say, no, we see by your transactions that you had a beer with your dinner, we don't believe this is good for your health. And so I think you used the word insidious earlier, and to me that's one of the most insidious parts of that document.
Does anybody else have a reflection on this? Eleanor?
I think that there's a lot of issues around the use of these kinds of big data, these kinds of databases for social control. This is yet another reason why we do need these technical solutions. One of the things that I think it was Stefan's comment points out is that if data exists, it will end up being used. It will end up being used in some way to control people socially. So as long as the databases exist, there's not much that we can do about it. We need to stop the data from being collected in the first place.
Is that even a plausible strategy?
No.
No, says Gerald. No.
And for a U.S. citizen, it's now basically under penalty of the IRS coming after you, not having healthcare records, not having something that's going to be accessed. It's almost inescapable. Mm-hmm. And it's already provided to the insurance companies. It's now being provided to the government. It's being aggregated by other people. Of course it's there. And I think Eleanor's not believable if she believes that people won't keep it in databases, no matter what the law says.
And certainly many of us...
Of course it will be kept in databases.
Yeah.
Of course it will be kept in databases if it's being collected in the first place. That doesn't mean that we need to acquiesce to it being collected.
But I mean, also...
yes, that may be what the law says right now, but we can change this.
But Eleanor, also, I mean, most of us in our daily lives are offering up all of these types of information for free. We're handing it out, and I don't just mean in social media, but if we participate in very many structures I think almost regardless, anywhere, if you live in any of the sort of highly digitized nations, you do give away a lot of very personal information into databases for all kinds of things. And it might be very... I'm going to take a woman example. There are apps that people use on their phones to track their period and their fertility. This information, there are many levels of incredibly personal information that are stored somewhere. And there's no kind of discussion about why and how. There's also some kind of huge mindset shift, I think, where we should talk about how citizens and consumers act out of their free will with these issues. Yeah. Stefan, and then Daniel.
One interesting way is that when we talk about mass surveillance, because collecting metadata, that is in fact mass surveillance. You could even say, sometimes you hear the term, it's only metadata, but when you think about it, that's actually who talked to whom, who was at the same place, at someone else at the same time. That's kind of almost exactly the definition of surveillance. Mm-hmm. Without even looking at what people are saying, you get a lot of information. And one place where we actually could change things is the fact that the positioning of our mobile phones, the surveillance devices that most of us carry in our pocket all day, this needn't be collected and stored. I mean, we could tell the operators that, no, you can't do this. You can only do it for very limited purposes, and then you have to throw it away. What we do is kind of the opposite. And one of the perhaps most alarming things I've learned from the Snowden documents is that there seems to be at least 10 research groups working on a project called Co-Traveler. And what they are doing is to use this massive amount of information about exact positions of people and trying to do data mining and finding, I was close to Johanna a little bit more often than Johanna would have expected. There is something going on there.
Yes, that's right. Daniel?
I get back to the question on collecting data based on the consent of the user, and one difference between the US and the EU when it comes to the legal situation is that EU has this more broad data protection regulation, regulating how data is collected, stored, and so on, and the US does not have that kind of far-reaching legislation. It's just limited to specific areas. So that's a big difference. But then to get back to your question, the problem is that we put a lot of trust in data protection, put a lot of trust in the individual user's consent to protect themselves. If you give your consent to use something, then it's okay to process the data. And there, of course, you have a policy question because you click in, you accept all kind of user agreements in different situations, and then you hand out your data. And you maybe, is it really, can we really say that people can look after and realize the full consequences for their privacy in this situation? Or should the state go in and say, even though you have the consent, you can't do it like this? That's a policy question.
Daniel, are there any states that are looking out for privacy first? I
think we have in many countries have strong privacy protection. For example, Germany, and you can also see that the German view on data protection and personal integrity has affected also the EU. You can see this court case I mentioned earlier from the European Court of Justice declaring the data retention directive invalid. And we have also other cases from the highest court of the European Union that is saying that the protection for private life should be really strong. So I think Sweden isn't one of the countries that has the strongest protection for private life, but the influences from the EU can make it more important.
Gerald?
But Sweden does have poll, which I've made use of, to be able to delist myself from the healthcare system. So the only record they're allowed to keep is a record they're not allowed to keep any other records. But that means, of course, that I don't make use of any of those facilities. I have to pay for them, but I don't use them. And that, I agree with Eleanor, is, of course, the best way of not getting in the database is don't generate the data in the first place.
I think that, the internet today would seem to be a perfect surveillance machine. Everything we do can be traced and monitored, and also we are clicking accept buttons sort of indirectly or directly all the time. We've also, on shows like this, we talk a lot in an excited tone about the Internet of Things and driverless cars. So many, this idea that very soon, let's say within the next 5 years, pretty much everything we wear and use will be interconnected in some way. That makes many people feel that the ship has sailed, that it's too late to do anything about this. But I mean, I think as this conversation has demonstrated, the internet is also something that we build and shape. So I would like to ask each of you, what should we do? Which directions should we move in? What would be a good way, in your personal view, to take the internet when it comes to these issues? Andrew, let's start with you. Hello, Andrew?
Sorry, it was
Yeah.
mute went off.
That's right.
Going forward, and I've talked to a number of people about this and big data. It comes down to, first step is transparency. You need to know what's collected about you, who's collecting it, and where it's going. Two is you need to be able to review it. Having had my identity stolen 3 times now, and crossed with prisoners, crossed with housewives, crossed with random people who don't have social security numbers yet, the data is constantly invalid. What's being collected about you is probably 50% junk. And if you don't have any chance to review it and indicate that this is correct or not correct, then someone will create these big data sets about you and they'll make decisions based on wrong data. And then 3 becomes control. You should be able to control, be able to say, you know what, vendor A, I use you every day, say you're my cell phone, say you're whatever. I don't want you sharing my location with anybody else. You can share my browser preferences, you can share my phone metadata, but you cannot share my location. Maybe I'm a victim of abuse and I don't want someone buying that data.
Yeah.
Maybe I just don't want it shared because I don't want advertisers, knowing where I am locally.
Yeah.
I think those are the 3 big steps going forward.
Thank you. Eleanor, where do we go from here?
At the internet level, we need to re-engineer things. We need to rebuild the internet in the decentralized way that was originally designed, and we need to make sure that every layer is encrypted. It needs to be the end of clear text traffic, and that means not just clear text traffic that's clear on the wire, but keys that are actually controlled by users themselves. We need to make sure that we have an internet that we can actually trust. And that means that in the same way that we need transparency around the services that we provide, we need verifiability around the systems that we interact with. So we need to know that they're decentralized, know where the keys are, know that we can trust the encryption.
Gerald?
Yes, I would say you have to, as Eleanor said, design it in from the beginning. And that means for things like the Internet of Things, that we need to start thinking about how we make sure that they're not going to be linked with the person, so that we don't establish that binding because we keep breaking it constantly. So there isn't the crumb of bread trails. That keying is really very important, but in balance, I've had students look at good cop, bad cop in a thesis. We are going to have regulations that will say that yes, you have to escrow keys because law enforcement has legitimate reasons and society has legitimate reasons, but since I don't trust my escrow agents, I need to break up my key in a technical fashion such that it's going to be difficult for someone to recover that easily and thus reconstruct the key.
Daniel, briefly, what's next?
Yeah, you have to work together with policy issues and technical issues to understand each other. I think it's important and how they influence each other. Lawmakers, policymakers must understand technology, and technology developers must understand policy and try to implement reasonable policy goals and so on.
Yes, Stefan.
It's terribly difficult, and it's going to need both policy changes and technical changes. And I think we've seen some baby steps, at least. Only, I think, yesterday we saw, for example, changes to one of the basic security protocol called SSL. That is a direct consequence of the knowledge we got from the Snowden leaks. And we've seen several things changing in the way the big companies handle, for example, their internal traffic, which is a direct consequence of the fact that we actually know what's going on much better than we did only a year ago.
That's very good. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes, go right ahead. Yes?
My name is Mattias Norling, and I study here at KTH. And my question is, it's been a very negative tone during this entire talk that this is an issue and this is a problem. I would like to suggest that this is also a great possibility. I mean, we haven't ever had the possibility to create such a large picture about what it means to be human that we do today with all of this data. Isn't it also a possibility that we can use this for much good and actually progress the human civilization thanks to big data?
Interesting question. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that switch in tone. What do you all see? Maybe we haven't picked the panel for positive feelings about big data, but who does? Eleanor, you're smiling. Do you have a reaction to this?
I think that there are definitely things that big data can do for us. Public health is a really interesting area there. We're already seeing advances in evidence-based medicine that let us do completely new things that let us predict, for instance, heart attack survival much, much better. The challenge is just making sure that we can get the benefits that we can get and leave the risks behind, and then having an actual conversation, and not a conversation where we're told, oh, this is for your good, but an actual conversation about which risks we're willing to accept.
Daniel Westman.
I think there are many good uses for big data, of course. So I totally agree that you must be more positive also. But it's not either. You must be aware of the negative sides also. So of course.
I feel like there's a giant sign here saying, "At what cost?" Stefan.
Well, of course, every day I'm more or less amazed by the fact I can do by the net. But I can find people that I couldn't find in another way. I can meet people that I wouldn't have met. I can encounter ideas that I wouldn't have encountered otherwise. But on the other hand, the Snowden revelations have shook me really fundamentally. I mean, I couldn't imagine that all. I knew that all these things were technically feasible, but the fact. Sorry for being negative now again, but I knew that these things were technically feasible, but I couldn't have imagined that they were doing them. Some of them are incredibly reckless, like subverting cryptography standards knowingly, and also risking, for example, the whole infrastructure. For example, this Heartbleed bug that we heard about only a week ago, that actually puts everyone at risk.
Can you just explain briefly what that is?
One of the basic security protocols at the net is called the SSL, and that is used for pretty much everything, including, let's say, banking and healthcare and all kinds of sensitive data that you use on the net. And one of those implementations was fundamentally flawed, had like a wide open hole. And the NSA knew about this, I'm sure about that, and they decided not to tell the world, but let us live with this risk instead.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly reckless to do. And I wouldn't have imagined that they would do a thing like that.
Do we have another question from the audience? I think we may have crushed you with our negativity.
But I can say a word about healthcare records, because I did my doctorate at the University of Utah, and as some of you may know, it's the geneticist's dream environment, because you have only, at the time in the 70s, only about 1 million unique individuals contributing to the gene pool, and in the words of one of the geneticists, and they breed like rabbits, and they mostly never leave the 7-state region. All of the hospitals in the state submitted every hospital discharge record to the LDS, Church Hospital. It was correlated against the, LDS database for genealogies, which is very, very extensive, and they've bought data from everywhere that they can. They correlated against state tumor registries. So the advantage was they could actually go and say, 14 women in this family have this particular type of cancer, and actually go out and do genetic sampling. And the result is, of course, that you can provide very, very good health care information to these people. However, you do so giving up privacy. And the difficulty basically is it isn't an either or. Once you've given it up, it's very, very hard to actually track it.
And there is a debate, for instance, about hereditary disease, whether it should be the patient's choice whether to be tested or not, for instance. But
that's a personal integrity issue.
Yes.
And as soon as you take that away, then we've given up personal integrity.
I think I saw a question in the front row, did I? Yes. Yes, I did. Go.
Hello, my name is Birkin. I'm an exchange student here in KTH. And we did a research in the beginning of the year concerning with social media, and our slogan was "The Internet never forgets." And recently I read an article about the Google Glass used in California, especially in the Silicon Valley area. And a bunch of Google Glass users got punched in the face in the middle of the street because they had a Google Glass. And I see this as an alarming rise of concern of personal privacy and wearable technologies, as you stated before, are an upcoming trend. What do you think about this? Do you think that this is going to be a more violent technological world now? Or like, is Google Glass a better thing? Is the worst thing? Does wearable technologies help the darknets, or, you know?
It's a pretty open question, but I hear,
Yeah.
what I hear is, are we heading fast towards a cyberpunk dystopia? But, Stefan?
I have no idea. Projections going further than a week or perhaps a month about the internet tend to be wrong, so I pass on that one.
Daniel?
But it's a trend that new technology, you usually get fears for privacy. That's usually the thing. When the data, the big computers in the 1970s, there was a beginning, this was a fear from what could be done by this initial reaction. So I think it could be useful to have that initial skeptical reaction, but probably in a couple of months you get over that reaction when it comes to Google Glass. Everyone wears it. So and it's also interesting to see how will all this affect our view of what is privacy really. So in the long run, maybe someone looks at next generation looks at privacy, what's private, what's not, in a totally different way.
What is home, what is the body, that will also change.
All these borders can be dissolved. So.
I realize I'm going to make an executive decision now based on all the worried looks in the audience. I think we should be constructive. I would like practical advice from each of you. Let's just do a very brief round because we're running out of time to answer this question. How do you all think we should act in our everyday lives in the light of all of this surveillance, for instance, going on, and all of these risks that you have so eloquently charted out? Could you tell us like one practical thing to do? Let's start with Stefan.
Yeah, let's use cash. It's faster, it's anonymous for sure, and you don't have to worry about the card working or not.
That's great. Let's use cash. In not all places accept cash anymore, but where possible.
If they don't accept cash, choose someone else.
Okay, that's good. Daniel, what would you suggest?
I don't know. I don't really have that kind of simple solution to that question. I pass on that, I think.
Okay, Gerald?
I think you just have to live every day committed to the things that you do. The things that you believe in doing, you do them. And the things that you don't agree with, you don't do it. You simply say no. So the stores that don't accept cash, I don't shop in anymore. It's very straightforward. Mm-hmm. If a bank's now going to say, no, you can't take cash out, which some banks are leaning to in Sweden, I'll say, fine, there are other banks.
Mm. Eleanor?
I think that it's useful to, where you can, support initiatives that are actually changing the larger structures. And this is actually an everyday action. There are a lot of projects out there that would love support, and helping and pitching in to help build that infrastructure will make a huge difference in 10 or 20 years.
That's solid advice. Andrew Lewman.
I'm going to echo what I've heard in that there are not some simple solutions. Gerald's solution sounds really good, depending on your situation. And I agree with Eleanor that upgrading, supporting organizations that support change are a fantastic place to start.
Yeah, I'm going to add in that case, maybe we should look at using these anonymity and cryptography tools where possible. People who don't know how to do that, like me, should look into it very carefully and soon. And maybe another one, at the risk of sounding like a total hippie, live in your truth. That is, try to live in accordance with your values if possible, because if you live in a society where that is possible. Because having secrets doesn't seem to work anymore. So hypocrisy is pretty much going fast. All right. You know what? That's all we had time for this evening. Don't forget that you can chat with our professors who are moving backstage to do just that. Please give a big hand to Gerald Maguire, Daniel Westman, Stefan Nilsson, Andrew Lewman, and Eleanor Saitta. Crosstalks will be back on September 18th with 2 brand new topics. Until then, be safe and be brave.